Blaire Whitcomb looked at me like the color of my skin was evidence of a crime. She pointed at my truck and told the officers, "Get this black man off our property." I didn't argue with her. I unrolled my survey map, or set it on the hood, and asked them to call Sheriff Caleb Harlan. Blaire laughed out loud, certain I was stalling for time. 10 minutes later, the sheriff pulled up or opened a thick folder with my name printed across the cover and asked her one quiet question that shut the whole front gate up. "Mrs. Whitcomb, who told you this was HOA land?" Or, if you enjoy stories where contempt finally gets an invoice, subscribe and stay to the end to see exactly what Blaire loses. Or, my name is Isaiah Reddick. I'm 48 years old, and the land I work sits on the eastern edge of a place called Ashford Ridge. 19 acres of it, give or take, or running from a creek bed up through mixed hardwood to a fence line my grandfather strung with his own hands. He bought that ground in the 1950s, or back when the whole valley was pasture and nobody with money wanted any part of it. My mother kept it after him, and when she passed I kept it after her. And in all that time, not one Reddick ever signed a single page of homeowners association paperwork. We were never members. We were never asked. We were simply there first, which is a fact that some people find harder to accept than any argument you could make out loud. For about 11 years, I leased a portion of the acreage out and let a management company handle the details. Because my work took me across 3 counties doing forest restoration and land stewardship for people who owned more ground than they knew what to do with. I'd walk somebody's back 40, tell them which oaks were dying, mark the invasives, plan a burn. It's honest work, and it keeps you outdoors in clothes that get ruined by lunchtime. So when I finally decided to come back and manage my own place directly, I showed up looking exactly like what I am, which is a man who works with his hands, driving a truck with a cracked side mirror and a bed full of flagging tape. What I found when I started walking the boundary in earnest was the reason I stayed. There were Ashford Ridge signs planted well past my fence corner, the nice carved ones with gold lettering that cost more than a good chainsaw. There was a new paved lane, freshly striped, curving through a stretch of my woods toward what the community called the East Gate. There were landscaping crews running mowers across ground that belonged to me, on a schedule, like it had all been settled years ago. And near the entrance, somebody had built a guard shack, small and white, with a little window unit humming in the side of it. None of that made me angry, not right away. In my line of work, you learn that most boundary problems start as honest mistakes and then harden into habits because nobody wants the embarrassment of undoing them. So I did what I always do. I got out my equipment and started measuring quietly, taking my time, writing everything into a field book with the date at the top of each page. I photographed every sign, I photographed the shack from 4 angles. I stood there on a cold Tuesday morning, with my breath showing, and thought that this would probably take a few phone calls and a couple of polite letters to fix. That was the morning I met Blaire. She came down the paved lane in a white sport utility that had never seen a gravel road, parked at an angle, and got out in a camel coat and boots that were made for a sidewalk. She watched me for maybe 15 seconds, and when she finally spoke, her first words were not a greeting and not a question about who I was. She said, "Which company hired you?" I told her I hadn't been hired by anybody, that I owned the land she was standing on. She looked me over slowly, from my muddy boots up to my work jacket, and said with a little smile, "I think you're confused." Then she informed me that this entire area fell under Ashford Ridge, that there were standards here, and that she'd appreciate it if I'd wrap up whatever I was doing. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't repeat myself. I just said, "Then we should probably check the records." and I watched something flicker across her face at that word. Records. Like I'd said something rude in front of company. Or, the letter came 6 days later on heavy cream paper with the association crest embossed at the top. And reading it in my kitchen with coffee going cold was the moment I understood that Blaire had no intention of checking anything. It was styled as a formal notice of violation. I was instructed to stop parking a commercial vehicle near the gate, to remove all surveying equipment from the area, to take down an old iron gate my grandfather had hung in 1968, and to cease unpermitted commercial activity within the community. Every item had a compliance deadline and a fine attached, escalating weekly. At the bottom there was a line about how continued noncompliance could result in a lien. A lien on property that had never been subject to their governing documents sent by an organization I had no contractual relationship with whatsoever. I sat there a long while with that page in my hand. In 20-some years of managing other people's timber and easements, I have read hundreds of covenants. And there is a specific kind of confidence you only see when somebody has never once been told no. That letter had it in every paragraph. It didn't ask me to explain myself. It assumed I would fold. I called the association office the next morning, and Blaire picked up herself, which told me the office was mostly a phone on her kitchen counter. I introduced myself again and asked, plainly, which recorded document made me subject to their rules. She said, "You are adjacent to our community. You are held to our standards." I asked her to send me the instrument number for whatever covenant she believed encumbered my parcel. She said she'd have to look into it. I asked when. She changed the subject, and this is the part I remember most clearly, because she started talking about how things looked. The trucks, the old fencing, the equipment sitting out. She said the area didn't reflect the kind of residence Ashford Ridge attracts, and then she paused just long enough for both of us to hear what she'd actually said. That was when I stopped thinking of it as a landscaping disagreement. Because you can argue about a fence. A fence has a location and a date and a receipt. But when somebody tells you that your presence doesn't reflect a standard, they're not describing the fence anymore, they're describing you, and there is nothing in a rule book you can point to that fixes that. I hung up, went outside, and stood at my grandfather's gate for a while, looking at the paved lane cutting through his woods. And I made a decision that has served me well my whole life. I would not raise my voice one single time. I would just be absolutely, exhaustively correct. So I hired an independent surveyor out of the county seat, a careful man in his 60s, who charged too much and deserved every dollar. I told him I didn't want a favorable answer. I wanted a true one. And if the truth was that I'd been wrong about my own fence line for 11 years, then I'd rather find out from him than from a judge. He worked for 2 weeks, pulling old deeds, chasing monuments, setting new pins with orange caps that stood up out of the leaf litter, like little flags of an army nobody had noticed arriving. His preliminary numbers came back on a Thursday, and I read them standing in my driveway. The association was occupying more than 2 acres of my ground. Not 2 feet, not an accidental sliver, but 2 full acres of maintained lawn, ornamental beds, an equipment yard, that guard shack, and a substantial stretch of the paved lane leading to the east gate. All of it sat on land recorded under the Reddick family name, and it had been sitting there long enough that the sod had knit itself into my soil, like it had always been part of the place. I did not act on it. That's the part people don't understand about situations like this. Everything in me wanted to drive up that lane and put a chain across it and let them come find out why. But a man in my position does not get the benefit of the doubt, not from an association board, not from a deputy responding to a call, not from a neighborhood watch group with a phone tree. So I put the report in a folder, ordered a full boundary survey with a certified plat, and waited. I wanted to be so far past certain that when the moment came, all I'd have to do was stand still. The thing that made everything afterward make sense was buried in a county file drawer, and my surveyor found it because he's the kind of man who reads the whole folder instead of just the part he came for. He called me on a Saturday and said, "You need to see this before I put it in writing." I drove down and met him in the records room, and he slid a photocopy across the table with a highlighted paragraph in the middle of it, and I read it 3 times before I let myself believe what I was looking at. Back when Ashford Ridge was raw dirt and survey stakes, the original developer had approached my grandmother about the road situation. Their construction traffic needed a way to reach the eastern half of the site without tearing up the county road, and the natural route ran across the corner of our property. My grandmother, who was practical and not particularly sentimental about mud, granted them what the document called a temporary construction access license. She let them use it. She did not sell it. She did not deed it, and she did not make it permanent. The license had a term written right into it, plain as a receipt, and that term had expired more than a decade ago. Nothing anywhere transferred ownership of that ground to the association. Not a quitclaim, not a dedication, not a recorded easement, not a boundary line adjustment. The developer had built the road on a permission slip, and then walked away when the project sold out, and the association had inherited the road the way you inherit a rumor, believing it was theirs because it had always been there and nobody had ever said otherwise. But it got worse, and this is the piece that eventually cost Blaire everything. The map the association had been using for years, the one on their wall and in their welcome packet and in the back of their rules booklet, showed that entire corner shaded in as part of Ashford Ridge. Somebody at some point had drawn my grandmother's temporary favor into the community as permanent geography. It wasn't a recorded plat. It had no recorder's stamp, no instrument number, no surveyor's seal. It was a drawing. And every board member who'd ever looked at it had come away sincerely believing the association owned land it had merely been allowed to borrow. I gathered everything into one accordion folder: the deed, going back through my mother to my grandfather, the recorded plat with the county stamp on it, the expired access license, the new certified survey, photographs of the signs, the shack, the equipment yard, the lane, each one time stamped, a copy of the violation letter with its threat of a lien. I made 3 complete sets, because a man who has been told his paperwork is probably fake learns to carry spares. Then I did one more thing, and it turned out to be the smartest thing I did in this entire story. Blaire had already had her gate staff turn me away twice from my own east boundary, once with a raised voice and once with a hand on the truck door. I could see the shape of what was coming. A civil boundary dispute is a slow, boring thing that gets resolved with lawyers and maps. But a trespassing accusation is fast, it's loud, and it can be made by anybody with a phone against a man standing in a field. I did not intend to let this become that. So I drove to the sheriff's office and asked to file an incident report. The deputy at the desk was polite and a little puzzled until I laid the folder open, and about a page in he said he'd get somebody, that somebody was Sheriff Caleb Harlan, 55 years old, gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who has heard every version of every story twice. He didn't tell me I was right. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He read for 20 minutes while I sat there, and then he tapped the expired license with 2 fingers. He said, "Mr. Reddick, I want to be clear about something. This office does not decide who owns land. That's a court's job and a title company's job. and I'd be out of line pretending otherwise. Then he leaned back, but if somebody calls my deputies to remove a man from ground, the current recorded documents say belongs to him, I'd rather my people know that before they're standing in it deciding in 90 seconds what took a surveyor 2 weeks. He had a folder made. He put my copies in it. He wrote my name on the tab, and he told me if anything happened out there, to ask for him by name. I want to be honest about how I felt walking out of that building, because it wasn't triumph, it was tiredness. I had spent money and weeks assembling proof of a thing I already knew, purely because I could feel in my bones that at some point I was going to have to prove it, while somebody stood over me insisting otherwise. That's a particular kind of exhaustion, you prepare for a moment you hope never comes, and then you get in your truck and go home and hope you wasted the effort. I did not waste the effort. It happened on a bright Wednesday in the second week of the month, cool enough that the frost hadn't burned off the low spots yet. I'd come out early to check the new survey pins near the east gate, because a landscaping crew had been running a skid steer through there, and I wanted to make sure the monuments hadn't been knocked out. I had a clipboard and a camera and a coffee going cold in the cup holder, I remember there was a woman jogging past with a small dog, and I nodded at her, and she nodded back, and for about 4 minutes it was an ordinary morning. Then the white sport utility came down the lane fast enough that I heard it before I saw it, and Blaire got out with her landscape manager trailing behind her, a young man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. She didn't say good morning. She said, "You need to leave. Right now. I've asked you twice." I straightened up, kept my hands where they were, and answered her the same way I'd answered every time. "Blaire, I'm standing on my own parcel. There's a pin 18 inches from your left shoe." She took her phone out and dialed while looking directly at me, which I understood was meant to be a threat, and which I found, honestly, almost a relief, because I had spent 5 weeks getting ready for exactly this. I set my clipboard on the tailgate. I did not step toward her. I turned my camera on and let it run and said nothing at all, while she told the dispatcher there was a man refusing to leave the community and that she felt unsafe. That last word did a lot of work, and both of us knew it. Deputy Nolan Pierce arrived first with another officer behind him, and to his credit he came in calm, hands loose, asking what was going on rather than announcing what he'd decided. By then a few residents had drifted up the lane, the way people do, a couple with coffee mugs, one man in cycling clothes. Blaire waited until she had that audience. Then she raised her voice so it would carry, pointed one finger at my chest, and said the sentence I will hear for the rest of my life. "Get this black man off our property." I've thought a great deal about that sentence. Not the first 4 words, which were just an eviction. The middle of it. She'd known my name for 5 weeks. She had written it at the top of a violation letter. She had set it into a telephone. And standing there in front of her neighbors, with a badge present, the identifier she reached for wasn't Reddick and wasn't the landowner and wasn't even that man. It was my skin, offered up as if it were a description of my legal standing. In a way, I owe her for it, because until that morning I'd still been willing to believe this was a filing error. She kept going while I stood there. She told the deputies I had entered the community without authorization, that I was disturbing residents, that I had been misrepresenting myself as a property owner for weeks, and that I had ignored multiple lawful directives from the association. She spoke in complete, confident paragraphs, the way people do when they've never had to be accurate. Deputy Pierce listened, then turned to me and asked, evenly, whether I had documentation. I did. I handed him the deed and the certified survey, and I told him where the pins were and what the orange caps meant. He looked at the plat for a long moment, then at the ground, then at the pin near Blaire's shoe. Blaire laughed. It was a short, bright, dismissive sound, and she said, "Anybody can print a piece of paper." The cyclist behind her laughed too, a half-second late. I looked at Deputy Pierce and said the only thing I'd been saving up. "Call Sheriff Harlan. He has a file." There was a pause. Pierce asked me to repeat it. I did. He stepped away and got on his radio, and Blaire told the other officer, loud enough for everyone, "He's trying to intimidate you. He does this. There's no file." She said it twice, and the second time her landscape manager quietly walked back toward his truck and did not return. 9 or 10 minutes later, a county vehicle came up the lane at an unhurried pace, and Sheriff Caleb Harlan got out with a folder under his arm that was noticeably thicker than anything Blaire had ever seen me carry. He did not shake my hand. He didn't nod at me like we were old friends, and I have always been grateful for that, because in front of that crowd any warmth toward me would have been used later to say the whole thing was arranged. He greeted the deputies, asked Blaire her name as if he'd never heard it, and then said, "I'd like each of you to tell me what happened, one at a time, and I'd like you not to interrupt each other." Blaire went first and gave the same speech, a little more polished now, with a new detail about how she'd been patient with me for weeks. She finished with, "Sheriff, this is association property." It has always been association property. I told my version in about 90 seconds, because there wasn't much to it. I said I'd come to check survey monuments on my parcel. I'd been asked to leave. I'd declined, and I'd offered my documents. Harlan set his folder on the hood of his vehicle and opened it. He took out the recorded plat, the county copy with the stamp in the corner, and he smoothed it flat with his palm. Then he turned it so Blaire could see it right side up, which struck me as a deliberate courtesy. He put his finger on a spot near the center of the shaded parcel. "This is roughly where we are all standing right now," he said, and he moved his finger a half-inch to the name printed inside the boundary lines. Iaha Reddick. He let that sit for a second. Then he said, and I want to quote him carefully because he was careful, "I need everybody here to understand what this is and isn't. I don't decide who owns land, if there's a genuine title dispute, that gets settled in civil court with attorneys, and this office has no role in it." He looked up. "What I can tell you is that the currently recorded documents in this county show this parcel in Mr. Reddick's name, and that gives my deputies no lawful basis to remove him from it or to charge him with trespassing." Blaire's chin came up. "We have our map." "I'd like to see it," Harlan said, and he meant it. She sent someone to fetch it, and 4 minutes later a young man came jogging back with the framed community map from the gatehouse wall, glass and all, which in hindsight was almost tender. Harlan took it, tilted it toward the light, and studied it longer than he needed to. Then he handed it back. "Ma'am, this is a nice drawing. There's no recorder's stamp on it. There's no instrument number. There's no surveyor's seal or certification. This is an internal exhibit. It's not a recorded plat and it doesn't convey anything to anybody." He said it without any edge at all, which somehow made it worse for her. The cyclist behind her had stopped smiling. Harlan went back to his folder and drew out the old access license. He read the caption aloud, then the term, then the expiration date, in the flat voice of a man reading a serial number. He looked up at Blaire and asked, "Are you telling me the association's claim to this ground rests on a temporary construction permission that ran out 11 years ago?" She didn't answer. And here's the thing about a woman like Blaire in a moment like that. She didn't apologize and she didn't concede. She simply stopped talking, and you could watch her rearranging the story in real time, hunting for the version where none of this was her doing. Then Harlan looked past all of us. over at the little white guard shack with its window unit humming, and he said the sentence that ended the morning. According to the survey the county's currently reviewing, that structure may also be sitting on Mr. Reddick's parcel. He turned back to the deputies. There's nothing criminal here. This is civil. Everybody go home. Or, for the first time since I had met her, Blaire Whitcomb was not smiling. Or, I want to say she went quiet after that she took the weekend and called a lawyer and came back reasonable. She did not. Within 4 days a letter went out to every household in Ashford Ridge, and I know exactly what it said because 3 separate residents brought me copies, which tells you something about how it landed. Or, it described an outside landowner who was attempting to claim portions of the community's shared amenities, warned that the situation could affect the East Gate access, and asked residents to be cautious and to report any activity near the boundary to the association office. Or, not one sentence of it was technically a lie, and every sentence of it was designed to be misunderstood. I was the outside landowner. I was claiming land. What it left out was that the land was mine, that the association had never held a single recorded interest in it, and that the association president had been asked directly for an instrument number and had never produced one. Or, it worked for a while. A woman who'd waved at me twice stopped waving. Somebody photographed my truck, and the photograph made its way around. Or, a man I'd never spoken to pulled alongside me on the county road and told me through his window that some of us have to actually live here, which I've never fully decoded, but which wasn't friendly. Or, and I understood then that Blaire's real skill was never property law. It was making people feel that a community was under threat, and then standing in front of them as the only thing between them and it. Or, I didn't respond to any of it. I filed a formal request with the county for an official boundary verification, which is a slower and much heavier process than a private survey, or because it puts a government surveyor's name and reputation on the outcome. The county assigned Marissa Cole, a land records specialist in her early 40s who wore a reflective vest over a cardigan and had the unsentimental patience of somebody who spends her life telling people their fence is in the wrong place. Or, she was not on my side. She was on the side of the monuments, which turned out to be enough. Or, she spent 3 weeks in the field and in the archives, and what she found was bigger than my 2 acres. The map the association had used for years, the one Blaire had brought out in its frame, wasn't merely uncertified. It was based on an early draft plat from the development phase, a preliminary layout that had been revised before recording. The version the county recorder actually accepted and stamped was different in exactly one meaningful respect. The eastern boundary had been pulled back off the Reddick parcel because the developer's own attorney had known perfectly well that they only had a temporary license there. In other words, for something like 15 years, Ashford Ridge had been operating off a superseded draft. Marissa laid the 2 versions side by side on her office table and walked me through it line by line, and then she said something I've repeated many times since. It's rarely fraud. Usually somebody grabs the wrong file once, and everybody after them assumes the person before them checked. Her verification confirmed the whole picture. The ornamental landscaping strip, the guard shack, the maintenance equipment yard, roughly 400 feet of the paved lane, and 2 of the carved entrance signs all sat on my parcel. The association's legitimate interest in that ground was a temporary construction license that had expired 11 years earlier and had never been renewed, extended, or converted into anything permanent. The board found out the way boards usually find out, which is all at once and from the wrong direction. Marissa's report went into the county file. The county file is public, and a longtime board member named Grant Hollis 52 years old, and the kind of man who reads the whole packet before a meeting, pulled it. Grant had been solidly on Blaire's side through all of this. Or he'd voted for the violation letter. He was, by his own admission later, the person who told two neighbors that I was probably running some kind of scheme. Or Grant called me himself, which took a certain amount of spine. He asked whether I'd sit down with him and the association's attorney and walk through the documents. I said yes on one condition, or that everything be in writing afterward. We met on a Tuesday evening in a conference room at the clubhouse, and I laid out the deed, the recorded plat, the expired license, my survey, and Marissa's verification in that order, and I did not editorialize once. When I finished, the attorney took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes for a good while. Order. Then Grant asked the question that changed the shape of everything. He turned to Blaire, who was sitting at the end of the table with her arms crossed, and said, "How long have you known about this?" Or she said she hadn't known. She said she'd relied on the map like everybody else, that she'd inherited the situation, that she was as surprised as any of them, and it might have held, except that the association's attorney had already begun pulling the board's own correspondence in preparation for a title matter I'll get to shortly. 2 days later, Grant found an email from 3 years earlier, sent by the association's previous counsel, flagging a potential easement problem at the east access and recommending the board obtain a title review before making any further improvements in that area. It had been sent to exactly one person, the president. Blaire had never forwarded it, never put it on an agenda, never entered it into the minutes. 8 months after receiving it, she had personally championed the resurfacing of that lane and the construction of the guard shack. I was not in the room when Grant read that email aloud to the board, and I've been told I should regret that. I don't. From that point on, the fight stopped being the association against me. It became Blaire against the people she had spent 9 years impressing. What finally cornered her had nothing to do with race, or with me, or with anything she could spin into a story about outsiders. It was a bank. Ashford Ridge had been planning a substantial upgrade for 2 years, a renovated clubhouse, and a new automated gate system at both entrances, and the board had structured it as a refinance of the association's existing loan with additional proceeds. The lender did what lenders do. They ordered a title review of everything the association claimed to own, including the amenities that would secure the debt. The title company found the same thing Marissa had. The east access lane and the guard shack, both of which appeared in the loan package as association assets, sat on a parcel recorded to me, with no easement of record. The underwriting stopped cold. A lender will not finance improvements on ground the borrower cannot demonstrate a legal right to occupy, and no amount of internal maps changes that. The association's attorney explained it to the board in language none of them could misunderstand. To continue using the eastern entrance lawfully, and to have any hope of closing the refinance, Ashford Ridge needed a permanent access easement properly drafted and recorded. There was no way around it. No adverse possession argument worth the paper, no clever theory that survived contact with a recorded plat and an expired license signed by my own grandmother. And there was exactly one human being on earth with the authority to grant it. For me. I got the call on a Thursday afternoon while I was pulling honeysuckle out of a fence line, dirt to the elbows. It was Grant, and he was careful and formal, and he asked whether I'd be willing to attend a board meeting to discuss a possible agreement. I told him I would. Then I went inside, washed up, sat down at my kitchen table, and wrote out what I actually wanted, because I knew that if I walked in without it decided in advance, I'd end up negotiating on feelings. The meeting was in the same clubhouse conference room, 9 days later. Blaire sat directly across from me, still the president on paper, in a navy blazer, with a legal pad in front of her that she never wrote on. And she opened with a sentence I'd honestly been expecting, delivered in a warm, collaborative tone I had never once heard her use before. "Isaiah," she said, "I think we all want what's best for the community here." Or, I let that sit for a second. Then I said, "3 weeks ago you didn't use my name. You told 2 deputies to get this black man off your property." Or, nobody at that table looked at her. The attorney studied his notes. Grant looked at the window. Blaire's jaw tightened, and she said something about how things get said in stressful moments, and I didn't answer that, because there was nothing in it worth answering. Or, here's what I did not do. I did not ask for a fortune. I could have. A landlocked entrance is worth whatever the people who need it can be made to pay, and there was a version of that afternoon where I put a number on the table that would have taken the association years to recover from. I'd thought about it, but I've watched enough boundary fights to know that a settlement people can't live with isn't a settlement. It's a lawsuit with a delay built in. And more than that, I wasn't trying to win a neighborhood. I was trying to be done. So I read out 6 terms. 1. The association acknowledges the boundary in writing, consistent with the county verification, and records that acknowledgement. 2. The guard shack and the maintenance yard come off my parcel entirely, at association expense within 90 days. 3. The association reimburses my survey and attorney costs. Documented. No markup. 4. The association ceases issuing violation notices, fines, or lien threats regarding property it does not govern, permanently. 5. If the association wants a permanent access easement over my land, it pays fair market value determined by an independent appraiser, and it carries the maintenance and liability for that lane going forward. 6. The board sends residents a written correction explaining the actual facts of the dispute. The room was quiet when I finished. The attorney said the first 5 were straightforward. Grant asked about the 6th, and I told him it wasn't negotiable, because a letter had gone out to 140 households telling them a man was trying to take something from them, and I was not signing anything while that was the last thing anyone had read. Blaire objected. She said a correction would expose the association to liability, that it amounted to an admission, that the board shouldn't be bullied into a public statement by an individual with an agenda. She got about 90 seconds into it before Grant said quietly, "Blaire, stop talking." And she did. That was the moment I understood it was already over for her, and that it had nothing to do with me. The special meeting was held on a Sunday evening in the clubhouse, and about 80 residents came, which, for that association, was extraordinary. I was invited. I thought about not going, because I had already gotten everything I needed in writing, and there is a kind of man who shows up to those things purely to be seen winning, and I have never wanted to be him. But Grant asked me directly, and I decided that the people who'd been told a story about me deserved to hear the other one from the actual person. I brought 3 things: my deed, the county's boundary verification, and a single sheet of paper with a timeline on it, dates in the left column and events in the right, starting with my grandmother's signature and ending with the morning at the gate. That was all. No speech. When they asked me to explain, I stood up, walked through the timeline in about 6 minutes, answered 4 questions, and sat back down. Then Grant read the email. He read the date, the sender, the subject line, and the recipient. And then he read the recommendation about obtaining a title review. And then he read the date the board voted to build the guard shack, which was 8 months later. He did not accuse Blaire of anything. He just read the 2 dates and let 80 people do arithmetic. A woman in the third row, someone I'd never met, asked the question that finished it. If you knew there was a question about that land 3 years ago, why did you call the police on Mr. Reddick? Or, Blaire tried the map. She said she'd been working from the community map like every president before her, that the discrepancy was historical, that she'd acted in good faith to protect the neighborhood. But she'd already said she hadn't known, and now the email said she had. And once a room catches you standing on both sides of a fact, nothing you add helps. Or, I noticed that Sheriff Harlan wasn't there, and I found out later he'd declined the invitation on purpose. He told me it was a civil matter and a private association's business, and that his presence would have made it look like law enforcement had come to settle a neighborhood argument. I respected that enormously. Nobody rescued me. A county clerk found the right file and a board finally read it. Or, the vote to remove Blaire Whitcomb as president was taken by the board that night. And it wasn't close. There was no shouting. Nobody was arrested. She wasn't led out of anywhere in handcuffs, and I want to be clear that I never wanted that and wouldn't have enjoyed it. Or, she gathered her legal pad and her purse and walked out through a room full of people she had spent 9 years trying to impress, all of whom now knew that she had gambled the association's financing, its entrance, and its reputation, rather than admit that a black man in work boots might actually own the ground outside her gate. Or, that was the punishment. Not a courtroom, just the permanent, unfixable knowledge in every one of her neighbors' heads. Or, the easement was signed a little over 4 months later, on a Tuesday morning, in an attorney's office with a notary and a lot of coffee. The appraiser came back with a number that was fair, and the association paid it, and Ashford Ridge now has a permanent recorded right to use that lane, along with the maintenance obligation and the liability that goes with it. Their refinance closed. Or, the new gates went up in the spring and they work well, and I'm told the clubhouse is very nice. Or, the guard shack came off my parcel in 11 days, faster than the agreement required. The maintenance yard was relocated behind the tennis courts. The 2 carved signs that had sat inside my fence line went away, and the county map now shows a boundary with no ambiguity in it whatsoever, stamped and recorded, so that nobody 30 years from now inherits somebody else's mistake the way Blaire inherited hers, and then made it her own. I still drive the same truck. One afternoon last fall, I was out checking the fence along the creek, and Grant Hollis came down the lane on foot and stopped to talk, the way people do now. He looked at the truck, then at me, and grinned and said, "You still haven't traded that thing in?" I laughed and told him the truth. It was never the problem. Before I left that day, I stood for a minute at the spot where Blaire had pointed her finger at my chest and called it our property, and I thought about what actually happened out there. The sheriff didn't hand me that land the day he opened his file. It was mine before Blaire Whitcomb learned my name, mine before the first foundation was poured at Ashford Ridge, mine since a man with a mule and a bad back paid cash for it in the 1950s. The only thing that changed that morning was that she finally had to look at the evidence, instead of looking at the color of the man standing in front of her.